Deer hunting is a rite of passage for many in Michigan. November 15th is opening day for rifle season for deer. Thousands upon thousands of hunters of all ages flock to the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. We refer to it as up north lovingly. We go to campers, we go to our cabins or deer camps to get a shot at a buck every year. It's taken very seriously. Where I grew up, we would have November 15th off every year because the majority of people would be gone hunting on opening day. And some people, they would take their gun, they would take their camo and some hunting gear to go up north, but they would just spend the weekend hanging out, drinking beer around a fire, things like that, and not necessarily shoot deer. Initially, David and Brian had plans to go opening weekend to stay with several others in a family cabin in White Cloud, Michigan. And White Cloud is on the west side of the state, but up north. So David decided that he wanted to take his wife to a party, and the trip got postponed until the following weekend. On November 22nd, 1985, David Till, who lived in Troy, Michigan, got out of work early and took his wife, Denise, to lunch and asked if she wanted to tag along. She often did that with David and Brian, but she passed. Several other men were going to be at the cabin this time around. There was going to be David's dad, Art, and his brother, Archie. David's other brother, Matt, and 3 of his friends would also be there, and they were leaving the same time that David and Brian were. David cashed his paycheck and kept $50 for himself, and he gave the rest to Denise. Then he headed over to Brian's house at 2 p.m. Brian lived in St. Clair Shores. That is on the east side of the state, on the shore of Lake Huron. Brian was sleeping because he had worked overtime from second shift at Michigan Bell. So David sat there and spoke with Denise, Brian's fiance, for a little while he waited for Brian to wake up. So Brian woke up from his nap and he started to gather up his things, and he was expressing doubt to David, telling him that he didn't think it would be exactly fun to be crowded in a cabin with a bunch of guys. So David, still wanting the weekend to happen, he said that there was a couple of other places they could go to. They could go to Higgins Lake. There was a cabin there. Or there was a cabin just outside of Mayo, Michigan. Or they could get a room in the Mayo area. So just before 3 o'clock, David telephoned Denise. He wanted to make sure that she didn't want to go, just double checking on that. And she said no, she was sure that she didn't want to go. He also wanted to ask her if she wanted him to give him a call when he got there. He wanted her to know that there wasn't going to be a phone in the cabin, and the nearest phone from the cabin was 20 minutes away, and it was a payphone. And Denise said that no, that wasn't necessary, because it really wasn't uncommon in 1985 for cabins to not have any type of phone or any type of communication in them. After David got off the phone with Denise, David and Brian loaded their gear up into Brian's black 1980 Ford Bronco, and they headed north. Later that evening, David's brother Matt and his friends reached the cabin in White Cloud. They dropped their gear off. They left a note for David and Brian. If you guys get here and you want to come join us for a few drinks at the local bar, that's where we'll be. So Matt and his friends, they headed to the local bar. When they returned to the cabin, there was no sign of David and Brian. But Matt wasn't too worried. He just figured they went to another cabin, or maybe they just changed their minds. Like I said, there was no phone and no way to communicate with the people up at the cabin if they were coming or not. When Brian and David didn't show up back at home on Sunday evening, David's wife, Denise, was very worried, and Brian's fiancée, Janice, was also very worried. They were very punctual guys. They were responsible, and they had great communication with their partners. So if they weren't going to be home on time, one of them would have definitely heard from either David or Brian that something had happened. So Monday morning came and no word still from David and Brian. Denise went to work reluctantly, but then she ended up leaving early because Matt made a confession, which is David's brother, that David and Brian didn't show up to the cabin at all. So Denise was extremely worried, as she should be. She contacted Janice and said, we need to file missing persons reports. So Denise went to the Troy Police Department to file a missing persons report, and Janice went to the St. Clair Shores Police Department to file her report there because that's where Brian lived. And the police department said that she couldn't file a missing persons report because she wasn't family and she wasn't married to Brian. So then that meant his family had to come up from Florida to file a missing persons report. So then that following weekend was Thanksgiving, and several people from David's family and Brian's family drove up to the White Cloud area to the cabin to search the property and the cabin to see if there was any clues of anything to explain why they weren't there and why they didn't come home. And the families contacted the local radio stations and newspapers to get the word out. They even hired a pilot to fly over the White Cloud area to see if they could find anything about the Bronco, but it would be almost 20 years before there were any answers. Thankfully, to a few investigators, and particularly to one investigator named Bronco, that would get the family some answers. When David and Brian left on November 22nd, we have no way of knowing if when they originally left, they were going right to the Mayo area, or if they got going towards White Cloud and changed their mind and went to Mayo instead. But we do know that their first stop in the Mayo area was at the Walker's Bar and Bowling Alley, and according to eyewitness testimony, they come across a man named David Welch. David Welch was a regular at the Walker's Bar. He was there almost every single day, and he come across David and Brian. He said that the guys originally told David that they were going to White Cloud, but they changed their mind. They said it was going to be too crowded, and that's why they were in the Mayo area. Their plans for the weekend were to go hunting, do some drinking, and to flirt with some women. David told them that Walker's Bar was not really a place to pick up women. There was a place a few miles down the road named Northwoods. You might find some attractive women there. So by the time this conversation rolled around, David had plenty of drinks, and he said he was staying put. Brian had not had a lot of drinks at that point in time, and he said he was going to go to Northwoods by himself. And Till hung out with David Welch for a little while, just talking and drinking. The owner of Walker's Bar had stated that she noticed that David Till had way too much to drink, and so she decided to cut him off. But she stated that when she cut him off, he didn't give her any problems. He had asked if he could wait around until his friend got back, and then they would leave. And the owner of the bar said that that was okay, that he could stay and have some coffee with David Welch until Brian got back. So Brian at this time had reached the Northwoods Bar. He ordered a drink and sat down at the bar, and two pretty women dressed very nicely come in and sat down at the bar a little ways from Brian. Brian wrote a note and handed it to the bartender and asked him to give it to the women. The women looked at the note and promptly left, and Brian sat there casually drinking his drink, and then he left after that. And we don't know at all what the note said, but the women did not like it apparently by their behavior, and they left. Brian and David left Walker's Bar, and they got a little lost, and so they pulled into a man named Larry Barker's driveway. Larry happened to be outside loading some firewood into his truck with his son. Larry told his son that he was just going to check it out, make sure everything was okay. So Larry walked up to the Bronco. Brian rolled down the window and just said that they were a little lost, and they were just trying to get where they were, they were trying to get to where they were going to sleep for the night. And Larry gave them directions. Larry could tell that they had been drinking, but Brian and David gave him no problems, and they were on their way. So then David and Brian went and got a room at Ma Dieter's. It's just a little place right outside of Mayo. We don't know what happened to them Saturday morning. There's no eyewitness testimony saying where they were at Saturday morning, but they did happen to go back into Walker's Bar for some lunch, and the owner said that she did speak with them briefly and that they did leave behind a flannel jacket, but then they did not come back into the bar. So later on Saturday evening, David and Brian showed up at Winker's Lost Lodge Bar in Luzerne, which is just outside of Mayo. There, the waitress Cindy noticed the two come in because she didn't recognize them before, and they grabbed a table. She served them 2 beers, and then Brian got up and went into the bathroom. Cindy went over to get the money for the 2 beers, and Brian had come back to the table and told the waitress, "If you take his money, I'm going to kick your ass." Brian ended up paying for the beers, and Cindy did not like that comment. She went over to the owner, Steve, and said, "I don't want to wait on their table anymore. I think they should leave." And Steve Linker, the owner of the bar, had just opened the bar for business and went over to the table to see why they would say that to the waitress. Brian just said that was more of a sarcastic remark to David and not meant towards the waitress, and that they did not mean any harm towards Cindy. So by this time, Cindy was bartending at the bar, and they got a different waitress, and there were no other issues for the rest of the night at Linker's Lost Lodge bar. So Sunday evening comes around, and David and Brian return to the Lost Lodge bar. There's a woman there named Barb Boudreaux. She's a regular at a lot of the local bars. She notices the two guys come in, and she doesn't recognize them. She assumes that they are hunters from downstate. While she was up at the bar, the shorter of the two, she said, come up to her and grabbed her butt. And she yelled at them, and she went back over to the pool to play pool with her friend Ronnie Emery. And at this time, she was bent over to take her shot at the pool table, and the taller of the two came over and rubbed his groin area against her butt. She yelled at him as well, and she said to Ronnie that she really didn't like either one of them, and that they should probably get their asses kicked for touching women that way. Barb also stated that she saw two Duval brothers talk to the hunters that night, and then she left the bar, and she noticed their Bronco out in the parking lot. Around 2 o'clock that morning, at the end of his shift, a sheriff deputy named Dick Smith noticed a black Bronco appear to pull up out of a ditch near the Camp 10 store. He didn't want to deal with a drunk driver that time of night, and he just let them go. 3 years had gone by since anyone had seen or heard from David and Brian. So there was a task force meeting at the Flint Township Fire Hall, and there were 18 officers there. One officer had a good tip from an informant. They had been at a party one night at a bar in Wixom. They overheard a man named Raymond Duval. He also went by J.R. Duval. He said he gotten into a fight with the hunters outside of a bar one night and shot them, and that he buried them in the woods. He had also said that he took their Bronco and converted it into a pickup, and that it was in South Lyon, Michigan. It had been a few times now that the Duval name had been brought up during the investigation, so they wanted to follow up with the Duvals and see if this lead went anywhere. So who were the Duvals? The Duvals were 7 brothers and 1 sister, and they were known as the Duval clan. The main Duval brothers that we will be talking about will be Raymond Duval, known as JR, and his brother Donald Duval, known as Coco. They lived in the forests of northern Michigan off of the land in dilapidated trailers surrounded by garbage, old refrigerator parts, old car parts, and just a lot of junk laying around. Each member of the Duval clan had their fair share of a violent rap sheet. They had dealings in drugs, guns. They also had several chop shops, and they had a pig farm. They would tap into the power lines and steal electricity, and when asked JR what he did for a living, his response was firewood and welfare. The Duvals were hard partiers. They were hard drinkers. They had no problem hitting their girlfriends or their wives. They were very feared in the area. They were animal poachers. They had no problem going out and killing an animal unethically for food. JR stated that he would kill around 100 deer a year, and he had no problem using his chainsaw to cut up those deer to feed to his pigs. They would have these large pig roasts every year that had a couple hundred people attend, and they were short on meat one year at a pig roast. So JR, Coco, and a couple of other brothers got in the car, went down the road, and shot a cow from the neighbors. And they cut the cow up right there in the field with the chainsaw and took it back to the pig roast. It was said that the Duval clan was 3 steps below deliverance. JR would also boast about spending $200 a month on beer, and $200 a month on beer almost 40 years ago is a lot of money on beer. If you ask the locals about the Duvals in the area, they wouldn't say much for fear of retaliation from the Duvals. One cop in the area even said if he were ever to pull over a Duval brother, he knew to automatically call for backup. Now, the state had a solid suspect in the case, but there was one thing missing: physical evidence. There was no body, and there was no blood, there was no hair, there was no proof of the vehicle, no physical evidence whatsoever. Now, you don't necessarily need physical evidence to prosecute, but if you don't have the physical evidence, you definitely need solid eyewitness testimony to the crime. And they didn't have that either. So they had a strong suspicion on who did the crime, but that was all they had for many, many years. In 1998, Robert Lesnesky, who goes by the name of Bronco, was transferred to Oscoda County. He was a detective with the Michigan State Police, and he wanted to start from the beginning of the case of David Till and Brian Ognjan. He thought that if he started over from the very beginning and talked to everybody again, that he might be able to find something different that was possibly missed before. Now, when Bronco met Barb Boudreaux, he thought he was really onto something, and since there was still no physical evidence, he thought he might have a witness to the crime. So he decided to foster a relationship with her so that she would trust him in coming forward. There was already 2 possible witnesses that had turned up dead, and he wanted to protect any witness that he could. So now that Bronco had the relationship built up with Barb and had her trust, it was time to get her eyewitness testimony. He knew that if she was served an investigative subpoena, that would protect her. An investigative subpoena provides that a person is properly served shall appear before the prosecuting attorney and answer questions or produce subpoenaed evidence, and her eyewitness testimony is the subpoenaed evidence. The new Michigan Attorney General loved approving these investigative subpoenas, and he approved 3 of them for Bronco. The 3 investigative subpoenas went to Barb Boudreaux, Connie Sundberg, and Rocky Harmon. Connie Sundberg was someone that was in the paperwork that had stated that they were previously threatened by a Duval brother. She lived in West Virginia, and Bronco wanted to go in person to get her testimony. He wanted her to elaborate on what she meant by she was threatened. So I'm going to read you word for word what she said. That way there's no confusion. Connie Sundberg stated that Coco Duval came to her the day after the murders. He tried to kill me that morning. I told you he threatened me, but he actually tried to suffocate me. I started asking about what the hell he was talking about, killing people last night. The next thing I know, he's beating the shit out of me. He tried to choke me. I ran outside and he chased me. He tackled me to the ground and started pushing my face in the snow and mud. I couldn't breathe. I thought he was going to kill me. I finally ran away and went to my mother's house. The next subpoena went to Rocky Harmon. Rocky Harmon was married to JR and Coco's cousin Tammy. He was at the Wixom bar the night that the informant was there. He overheard the hunters bragging about saying that they killed somebody, but he also heard from JR and Coco that they put Brian and David in a tree shredder and fed them to their pigs. Next is Barbara Boudreaux's eyewitness testimony, and I want to read to you what she said in court because she gives the best witness testimony to paint the picture of what happened to David Till and Brian Ognjan that night. So she remembers being home that evening, and Ronnie Emery, her best friend, came over. He wanted to take her out to the Lost Lodge bar because he had shot his first legal buck. He wanted to take Barb out and have a couple of drinks. So they're drinking at the bar and they're playing pool. Barb goes up to the bar and the 2 hunters, David and Brian, come in. Brian Ognjan grabs Barb from behind and Barb tells him to back off. She then goes back over to the pool table. She bends over to take her turn, and that's when David Till grabs her from behind and rubs his groin up against her butt. That's when Barb turns around and tells David Till he needs to shove it up his ass. David and Brian went up to Barb and Ronnie and asked them if they wanted to play pool. And Ronnie and Barb said, no, we don't bet when we play pool. We just play for fun. David and Brian put some money up on the pool table anyways. And that's when Ronnie and Barb were like, no, thank you. And they gave up the pool table. Barb next makes the comment to Ronnie that from the way that those guys grabbed her, they should get their ass kicked. Then she noticed the Duval brothers come into the bar. She noticed that the Duvals seemed to recognize David and Brian, and so the Duval brothers sat near David and Brian. Barb also notices David and Brian pestering other women, grabbing their behinds, making lewd comments to them. Then Barb notices the hunters have some loud words at the Duval's table. Barb tells Ronnie she thinks stuff is getting out of hand and that maybe we should call the police. She hears someone behind her say, someone's already called the police. So Barb thinks that there still will be trouble and the police never show up. Barb and Ronnie sit at a table near the door, and she sees that Coco gets up and goes to a payphone that's near their table. He makes a phone call and says that we could use some help. 45 minutes later, two guys come in and they go straight to the Duval's table. A few minutes after that, someone from the Duval table comes up and asks Barb if she knows where they can get some weed at. She says yes, they do, and then that person goes back to the Duval table. Barb talks again to Ronnie about the hunters. Then someone from the Duval table gets back up, sets a 6-pack of beer on the table in front of Barb and tells her, why don't you go home? Barb is more than ready to go home, she says, and her and Ronnie go outside, and she notices the Ford Bronco outside parked a little funny. That's why she noticed the Bronco out in the parking lot. Around 10:30, Barb, Ronnie, and another man named Dick Baker go back to Barb's house. They start watching the movie Scarface on VHS. Barb notices that she hears a ping-ping sound that's not coming from the TV. So she's kind of looking around to try to see where the noise is coming from, and she opens the kitchen window to hear it a little bit better. She hears guys outside yelling and arguing. She hears the words, "You're dead, you rotten motherfucker." She goes back to the living room and tells Ronnie that the hunters are getting their asses beat. Ronnie says that he wants to see. So Ronnie and Barb go out the front door and they notice that there is a truck parked in her driveway that's blocking the vehicles in. Ronnie still wants to see what's going on, so they go back into the house and they go and sneak out her bedroom window. And they climb out the window, they go down the trail, and this trail leads to the back of Barb's property. Barb then hears someone yelling, "Somebody, please help us." Bob and Ronnie get to the clearing, and they can see across the street through the clearing, they can see a Bronco and a truck that is lighting up in the center of a few people. She sees Coco, JR, 3 other men, and the 2 hunters. She sees David Till on his knees and yells, "Please God, someone help us." She sees Coco bring the bat back again and hit him, but no ping sounds this time. She says it sounds like a pumpkin hitting the ground, and the hunter's head explodes. The other men are holding Brian down, but Brian breaks free and runs off. But the men that were holding Brian down go after him and catch him and bring him back. When they bring Brian back to where David is, Brian goes limp and he urinates on himself. JR and Coco kick and hit Brian until he goes quiet, and they keep hitting and kicking him some more. Barb says she can't watch any more of what's happening, and she heads back towards the house. As she's climbing inside, she hears Ronnie behind her. As soon as they both get inside and walk back into the living room, Coco and JR knock on her front door. Coco says, "You know, we know you. We know your family. You heard nothing. Pigs gotta eat too." Barbara closed the door. She looked out the window through the door, and Coco gets in the truck that is blocking her driveway and drives away. And she sees the other people get in the truck and the Bronco and drive away. Ronnie is pumped up, he says, and he wants to see where they bury the bodies. Barb and Ronnie follow them for a little while, but they lose them, and so Barb heads back home. The next morning, Ronnie goes to the clearing. Barb can't bring herself to go to the clearing, but she can see all the blood on the ground from the night before. And one might think, Why didn't Barb come forward sooner if she had all this information? And that's a very simple answer, and that's fear. She had just seen 2 men get beat to death by some very scary people that everyone knew in the area to not mess with. So she didn't want to say anything out of fear for her own life. There was a $100,000 reward out, and she didn't want to collect that money because if she said something and collected that money, then there would be a target on her back. At one point in time, Barb did have someone break into her home, but they didn't steal anything. Someone also shot her dog in the head. She also had a second dog that was killed. The dog was in her yard, and someone drove up into her yard and ran the dog over and killed it. And because of those things, and of course what she witnessed, is why she didn't ever come forward. But this was the testimony that she gave in court, and that is exactly what was needed to convict JR and Coco. After her testimony, the jurors went into deliberation, and they came back out 2 hours and 5 minutes later with their decision. But in the book that I read, Darker Than Night, which I've actually read it once before, years ago when it first came out, but in that book, it stated that the jurors knew after 10 minutes what their verdict was going to be. They just stayed in there longer so it didn't look bad on the jurors. So after 2 hours and 5 minutes, the jurors came out, and their unanimous verdict was that JR and Coco were guilty of first-degree murder, and they were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Since JR and Coco have been convicted of first-degree murder for the murders of Brian and David are still considered missing, and their case still is considered a cold case, and that's because since the 20 years that JR and Coco have been convicted, not one shred of physical evidence has ever been found. If you know anything of David Till or Brian Ognjan's remains, please contact the St. Clair Shores Police Department with any information.